The president issues an executive order this week to calm the crisis at the U.S.-Mexican border. Will it stand up in the court and keep immigrant families together? Former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, will break it down for us and talk about his new book. And a well-known U.S. cardinal is removed from ministry amid sexual abuse allegations. The papal posse, Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, will join us with analysis. And finally, as the population of Syrian Christians contracts, persecution of the Christians are on the rise. Here with an update is the leader of one of the largest Christian charities in Syria. The world over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Newt Gingrich, Father Gerald Murray, Robert Royal, and Father Alexei Shehadeh are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. It's easy to find. And now, some news from the world over. President Donald Trump is looking to quell the firestorm over U.S. immigration policy regarding the detention and subsequent separation of families entering the country illegally. On Wednesday, the president signed an executive order ending a process where children are temporarily separated from their families and cared for by the Department of Health and Human Services, while the adult members of the family are processed by immigration officials. Trump commented on the decision from the Oval Office.
I didn't like the sight or the feeling of families being separated. There's a problem that's gone on for many years, as you know, through many administrations, and we're working very hard on immigration. It's been just left out in the cold.
Here to give us his take on all of this and more is former Speaker of the House of Representatives and author of the new book, a bestseller, Trump's America, The Truth About Our Nation's Great Comeback. Would you welcome back to the program, Newt Gingrich?
Always fun to be
Thanks for being here. Tell me, I want to start with something the president said the other day as he signed this executive order. As you know, it was signed after a public outcry, a media expose on the separation of children at the border with heart-wrenching images, and the president said this.
So we're keeping families together, and this will solve that problem. At the same time, we are keeping a very powerful border, and it continues to be a zero tolerance. We have zero tolerance for people that enter our country illegally.
Now, Newt, earlier the president said he could only fix this problem if the Congress did it, that he couldn't do it via executive order. What changed?
Well, I think the public pressure changed, and I think he concluded that it was going to do dramatic damage if it looked like he wanted to separate children. The fact is, there are several court decisions and several agreements by the government that probably require a congressional law to change. But I think Trump concluded, issue the order. If somebody wants to file a lawsuit, which in effect would separate the children, let the burden be on them. And then he's challenging the Congress to pass. You can pass a simple, narrow bill that says we're going to keep the children in detention, but they're going to be kept with their parents. The great tragedy here is we can't have an honest conversation because the left is so hysterical. The truth is you can control the border without breaking up families. But, by the way, when Barack Obama did the same thing, somehow that wasn't a great national scandal.
In 2014,
right.
When there was another rush at the border and President Obama reacted the way he did. I can remember Democratic friends of mine enraged at that moment, but I don't recall anyone saying he was opening a Nazi concentration camp or that he was, an inhuman person over it. Didn't the president, though, do this to himself, Newt, by insisting on this zero-tolerance policy and then seemingly reversing himself, though he's not really changing the underlying policy here?
Yeah, I think they had not thought through the implications. And again, I think in an honest conversation, you can't just talk about children. 15, 16, 17-year-old members of MS-13 are not children. They're rapists, they're murderers, they're torturers, and So when you say to me, let's have an automatic commitment here, I think you take out human judgment and the ability to look at what are we really talking about. Second, there are some adults coming up here bringing children for sexual trafficking.
Yeah.
You know, they're not. It's not love. These are not all loving parents. And I think we have to be aware. I believe one of the big stories that will emerge this year is the degree of the war being waged by the cartels in Mexico.
Which goes totally unreported. I was just down at the border talking to border agents. I have to tell you, the things they shared with me, some of these men have been on the other side, they regularly go over, and since September, more than 200 Mexican politicians have been assassinated by the cartels.
Yeah.
This is the world that is just on the other side of that fence. I do think we sometimes lose sight of that and the world that these poor children and families are enmeshed in. No wonder they don't stop in Mexico and seek asylum there and they come to the United States.
Whoever wins the Mexican presidential election, we have a real obligation for our own safety to offer them maximum help in defeating the drug cartels. Because they literally, as you point out, I mean, when you start killing the mayor or the county commissioner or the judge, you intimidate the whole community.
Right.
And so you're beginning to have a Mexico that could in fact be dominated by the cartels, and a lot of the current policies are anti-American in the deepest sense.
Tell me the dilemma that the Trump administration or any administration would face in trying to enforce the border because of the Flores settlement and subsequent rulings by Judge Dolly G., who now we'll get into in a moment. The president is essentially asking the Department of Justice to go and ask that judge to walk back her decision or give them a pass from it. That essentially says you cannot detain children for more than 20 days. Then the subsequent decision said you can't detain the children with their parents. So they all had to be set free in 2015. So all the family detention centers, Newt, are gone. There are no family
First of all, I don't think that's ever been appealed to the Supreme Court.
No, it has not.
And they should. I mean, I think, look, at some point, crazy judges have to be taken head on. And the idea that a judge now defines the immigration policy in the United States, single person, one lawyer, is a dictatorship of lawyers.
But basically, you have legal obstacles now to enforcing, because it's either don't enforce the border or detain these people, but you can't detain them for more than 20 days.
Look,
that's the law.
Andrew Jackson, when issued an order by the Supreme Court, said they've issued their order, let them enforce it. What Trump should do is appeal directly to the Supreme Court on the grounds that this is a national emergency and ask for a suspension of her decisions.
It takes about 700 days for a hearing to make its way. Every time a family comes here, it takes about 700 days.
Should take 1 day.
Well, but it doesn't. And the president, remember, Ted Cruz he proffered a bill that would hire many more judges, immigration judges, and hasten the time that these families would, the time of their hearing, and then contract the time they would be in detention. The president said this, listen.
But one of them says, we want to hire 5,000 more judges. I don't want judges, I want border security. I don't want to try people, I don't want people coming in.
Your reaction?
Well, my reaction is twofold. One, I want border security, I don't want people coming in. And two, most of these ought to be a common sense decision. It ought to be a 24-hour cycle. You show up, you make a claim, do I believe you or not? If I don't believe you, you go home.
And you can't, but we should also say, again.
By the way, under Obama, I think for one of the Central American countries, 4% were being considered genuine. 96% weren't.
Wow.
So,
of asylum seekers?
Yes.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of fraud, and people are gaming the system. We get that. At the same time, you also see the human tragedy and the toll, and I think that's what Americans are reacting to. That's what so many people, like the Catholic bishops, who came out last week and said this policy is immoral. Your reaction to that as a Catholic?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not going to get in a fight with bishops as a Catholic, but what I would say about the church position is that it doesn't take into account the reality of how different the world is becoming. For example, there's a story today of people on ships going from Libya to Italy who are destroying their documents so that it's very hard to figure out, well, the burden ought to be on you to explain to me why I should believe you. It shouldn't be you show up with no documents because you destroyed them. Now the burden's on me.
Yeah.
And I think we have to confront a reality. There are millions and millions of poor people who in the age of television understand that there are better places. And if they can, they're going to go there. But does that mean that the Italians or the Austrians or the Americans have an obligation to be drowned by 10 million or 20 million or 30 million people who show up? Gallup did a survey a couple years ago. They estimated 165 million people would come to the U.S. if they could.
Wow.
Now, I mean, even crazed left-wingers would have to be asked the question, do you really believe you could absorb 165 million people without shattering your civilization?
Well, again, so many are saying, and they say that that's a heartless statement. We have to have we have to welcome the stranger. We have to be open to these people. They're in need, and we have the wealth and the prosperity to protect them and give them a better way.
But first of all, there's a limit to that. And second, I am very much for immigrants who want to work, who are prepared to become American, and who want to understand our society. I'm against people automatically showing up and saying, take care of me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the amazing thing, we have to, again, my belief is, look, there's no doubt, it's horrible and hard to watch these families coming here. It's a horrible trek they're making. My father's from Guatemala. He lived in Guatemala, okay? Suffered, dirt floor. I get the picture. I've been back to that village. You see the way of life? Everybody would want to come to America, and many do.
Right.
Because they're in poverty, they're in dirt. I get it. And the governments are corrupt and taking all the aid from them. However, you look at that and you realize since 2016, 110,000 unaccompanied minors were released into the United States. 200,000 family units were just released into the United States. Isn't that the alternative that we're really talking
First of
about?
all, you have to ask yourself the question, what happened to the parents that 110,000 minors showed up unaccompanied? I mean, what does that tell? I mean, don't we have some right to say to other people, you have a responsibility too? And this is an enormous problem worldwide. It's an even bigger problem in Africa, where the population increase is enormous. In Nigeria alone, by the end of the century, may have more people than all of Western Europe.
In your new book, Trump's America, there's a section on immigration. I read it the other day, and you have a quote from Arthur Schlesinger, and he says, "America is not a nation of individuals, but a nation of groups." Is that what's shaping not only what we're seeing in this immigration debate, but the way it's being perceived?
Sure. And of course, Schlesinger was decrying that,
right,
saying that the American Constitution says, or the Declaration of Independence says, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It doesn't say each of our groups is endowed. I think this whole effort to divide America up into groups, and here I'm with Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt gave a speech once and said he's against hyphenated Americans.
Right.
If you want to come to America to be an American, he's for you. But if you insist on being hyphenated and dividing yourself from other Americans, it is destructive of the very idea of America.
I want to shift on to, before I leave this topic, can Congress pass a bill? Doesn't look like any of the alternatives that they are floating now are going to get
I don't think you can pass comprehensive reform. I think you have to break it up and find a majority, one bill at a time, and pass 6 or 8 or 9 bills. But I don't think you can pass a comprehensive. I've said this since 2007 when Bush first tried to. Every time you put it all in one package, different pieces offend different people. And so everyone has a good reason to vote no.
Let's move on to this new Gallup poll. The president has a 45% approval rating among Americans. That's the highest number he's achieved really since January. Why do you think he's flying that high? Do you think this will have a negative impact on him, this entire debate about separating children?
Well, of course, I think the fact that he signed the executive order sort of cut the legs out from under what the left wanted to do to him. Because now the burden is on Schumer to explain why he doesn't want to pass a bill to solve the problem.
And to keep families together, because you got to get around the court rulings and get around the
which you could with the law. I mean, they could pass a new law and eliminate all of that. And Schumer prefers, he would rather hurt Trump than help children. It's an easy way to think of Chuck Schumer. I think there are two big things going on. I think one is the economy, where objectively you have the lowest black unemployment in American history. You have, for the first time I can remember, more people looking. I mean, there are more jobs than there are people looking for work. You have the highest small business confidence in history. I just got a report 2 days ago. You have the highest manufacturing so I think people are looking around saying, "Oh, this is working," and I think that's a huge part of it. And the other is that the North Korean meeting in Singapore, people look at the choice between nuclear war and at least they're talking. And I think Trump, for the average American, gets a lot of credit for having created an environment where Kim Jong-un came to Singapore and had a serious meeting. Of course, today they've released the remains of 200 Americans who were missing in the Korean War. So there are little things, confidence-building things going on. And I think people look at that and go, you know, this guy's a lot smarter than all these news media. And then his proposal for a Space Force, you may have seen
I was going to work to that, yes.
The crowd chanting, Space Force, Space Force.
Yeah.
I mean, he has a real instinct for what will arouse the American people.
Now, this has been a pet project of yours for a long time. I mean, when you were running for president,
I'm very
you
excited.
talked about this. How do you see this? His focus on a real new frontier. I mean, talk about innovation, which I know is at the heart of so much of what you do.
Well, President Trump and Vice President Pence are the most pro-space people we've ever had. Remember that John F. Kennedy wanted to go to the moon to win a competition with the Soviet Union on Earth. Trump actually wants to move from a handful of astronauts exploring to Americans becoming pioneers and colonists and moving into space. And so Trump's really talking about a very profound change. The Space Force would be like the U.S. cavalry in the West. But then you got to have wagon trains and you got to have factories and so behind that idea, you're going to see a series of ideas to go back to the moon and permanently, to go to an asteroid and start mining, and ultimately to go to Mars, but ultimately being pretty darn quick. And Trump's a guy who likes to move. And I think the bureaucracy was arguing about a Space Force, and he thought he would just cut through it and say, let's do it.
Wow. Let's talk about tariffs for a moment and trade wars with China. There's been a lot of back and forth, $50 billion in the last few weeks in tariffs. The president is threatening $200 billion worth of tariff on Chinese goods due to the trade inequities, that trade imbalance. Is this wise, given all you know about the economy, the global economy? Won't this hurt the consumer and ultimately redound to in the short term, hurt the American consumer?
Look, here's what I think happened. Up through the 1970s, we were so big and so powerful and so rich compared to everybody else that you could say to people, you're going to get cheaper goods at Walmart. And they go, that's terrific. Sometime in the 90s, they began to think, well, if I don't have a job and I can't afford to go to Walmart, cheaper goods doesn't help me.
Right.
And we watch China cheat. I mean, let's be really clear about this. Chinese system is based on methodical, systematic cheating. And there's going to be a huge tension because we're now stepping in, for example, under Obama, not Trump, under Obama, the Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, said the Chinese annually steal $460 billion in intellectual property. Wow. That's more than our total sales to China. So we're now stepping in, and the president is saying, I'm not going to let you cheat anymore. Well, the guy who's been making a good living cheating
he's
not going, well, no, wait a second. I mean,
I like the old deal.
I like the old deal. It's a little bit like, it was controversial in Europe, but I thought it was very fun when Trump went to the G7 and said, you guys have been doing great at ripping us off. That's now over.
Right. You can defend your country, and I'm going to defend mine.
That's exactly right.
Final question. Midterm elections are coming up. We see a lot of volatility even in that generic ballot, though the gap has closed. Given what you're seeing now, the hand-wringing over the border issue, Kim Jong-un, the summit, and these trade wars, what do you think will ultimately happen? Will the Republicans hold both houses?
Republicans will gain 4 to 6 seats in the Senate. They'll lose some seats in the House, but I think in the end they'll keep control at about 225, 226.
Wow, that would be a historical
a huge
seat
event,
change.
but I just see it happening. I'm looking district by district, and I'm looking at the impact of Trump. I mean, Trump was in Duluth talking to 9,000 people in Minnesota in a district that's open that we're going to probably win. Tim Pawlenty has gone back to become governor again. I think he's going to win the governorship. I mean, you have lots of things in motion that don't fit this idea that there's going to be a blue wave.
Newt Gingrich, always
to be
great
with you.
talking to you.
Thank you.
Tell Rome and Callista we said hi. Trump's America, The Truth About Our Nation's Great Comeback by Newt Gingrich is available now at bookstores everywhere and online. Father Gerald Murray and Robert Royal are up next, but first a little news to share with you. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, the retired Roman Catholic Archbishop of Washington, D.C., has been removed from public ministry and faces further punishment over abuse allegations. Pope Francis ordered the 87-year-old cardinal's removal, pending further action after the Archdiocese of New York found credible and substantiated allegations that he sexually abused a high school-aged altar boy on 2 occasions when he was a priest some 40 years ago. Cardinal McCarrick, the Washington Archbishop from 2000 to 2006, is one of the highest-ranking U.S. church officials accused of sexual abuse to date. Here with analysis is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here and for making the trip, taking the time. We have a lot to get to, including there's a lot of back and forth this week, as you heard earlier with Newt Gingrich, about immigration. The Bishops' Conference last week issued a very strong statement saying that this policy of separating families is immoral. It should go no further. This reflects, of course, the papal thinking on this as well. We'll get to those comments later. Bishop Edward Weisenberger of Tucson rose on the floor of the Bishops' Conference. They were having their meeting down in Florida. And, well, he offered this, asking about canonical penalties for border enforcement agents. Watch.
In light of the canonical penalties that are there for life issues, I'm simply asking the question if perhaps our Canonical Affairs Committee could give recommendations, at least to those of us who are border bishops, on the possibility of canonical penalties for Catholics who are involved in this. And therefore, for the salvation of these people's souls, maybe it's time for us to look at canonical penalties.
Father Jerry, your reaction?
I was surprised, Raymond, when I heard that, because canonical penalties apply to crimes that you commit according to canon law. And working for the border agency is not a crime. Enforcing the United States law is not a crime. You can question the justice of the law, but the remedy for that is advocacy and try and convince the legislature to change it. You can have different points of view on this question of family separation. You know, you can look at from the point of view of saying, it's regrettable that parents and kids are separated at the border, but you can also say, why are parents trying to bring kids in illegally? Don't they know there's a risk that that might happen? So, I would not counsel at all even looking at the subject of canonical penalties, because people doing their jobs conscientiously are not committing any canonical crime.
Yeah, well, they would say this is an unjust law, and as you've heard, some of the hyperbolic language, this is like the people working at DACA or the people enforcing segregation. This is inherently evil.
No, it's not, because if someone commits a crime and they happen to have children, the children are not allowed in the jail cell with them. They're separated. People should know that if they break the law, there are consequences. Now, if people want to have open immigration, they can argue that point of view, but you can't say to the border agent, you have to agree with my point of view and ignore U.S. law when called upon to carry out your duties. And by the way, we're a humane people. These children are being put in circumstances where they're trying to be helped. And, you know, I don't consider this any way near a criminal activity by the border agent. That's wrong.
Robert Royal, give me a sense. There is this tension between the horrible images we saw of family separation, children being, you know, crying and upset as their parents are taken away or they're separated from them, and enforcement of the border. And it seems that because of the way the law and the rulings from Judge Dolly G, from that 1997 Flores decision, it requires that you release kids after 20 days of detention, and you can't keep families together. She shut down Judge Dolly G, all the family detention units in 2015. So how do you keep families together and enforce the border?
Yeah, there's no question that this is a complicated issue. Now, what we can say, I think in large terms, is no one likes the idea of innocent children. There are a lot of cases where there are not parents trying to bring children in. Something like 13-14% are,
according to Reuters.
Yeah, they may be coyotes, they may be being trafficked or whatnot. But look, 70% of the American people say they don't like children being separated from their parents, and I think that's exactly right. By the same token, though, because of the difficulties that immigration has caused, not only in this country, but we see it all around the world, something like 70% of Americans also want to see a zero-tolerance policy on immigration. So they want strict border enforcement, but not harsh penalties toward children. Now, that said, how you negotiate this, in my judgment, after decades here in Washington, government is a very blunt instrument. And so you see it in a case like this where what you're trying to do something that's kind of sophisticated, and it's not all that easy to craft the legislation, and it's perhaps even harder to get Congress to move on something like this. So we're going to be, I think it's important to debate this. It's important to be as humane as we can be. And I actually have a certain amount of trust in the border agents themselves, many of whom are Hispanic themselves, and know the concrete situation better than most of us.
No, well, look, as I said earlier, I was just at the border. You talk to these agents, they deal with the human misery every day. I also, one of these agents, he pulled up in the back of his car, he had a pile of toys, new toys, in the back of his car. I said, what are those for? He said, oh, a bunch of agents and I got together because we take that down to the facility here where the kids, you know, it's sort of the refugee resettlement center where the kids are. They bring toys to them, and they do that themselves. No agency is doing that. The government isn't doing it. They're doing it out of the kindness of their own hearts. But I think one of the things lost in all of this, and the demonization of people on both sides of this debate, and social media, what's being lost is we are dealing with human lives, and some of these children are being trafficked. And if it's 13% of every family unit, so a child with an adult presenting themselves at the border or crossing the border illegally, if 13% of them are not parents or true guardians, isn't it in the best interest of those children to vet every case and not just take them at their word? We can't as a government do that in the interest of caring for these children. That's my sense of this. And that, I don't think that's draconian. Naturally, we have to treat them humanely on this side of the border, as well as hopefully in their native country. But what is the obligation? Where does this fall on the line of moral teaching in the church, Father? If you had to put abortion at one end and everything else after it, where would immigration policy fall?
No, immigration is how we treat our fellow human beings, and particularly cases of people who are coming here for various reasons. But a nation has a right, according to the Catechism, to regulate immigration and to regulate who gets into the country under what circumstances. So having borders is not an offense against other nations. Now, how it's handled is a political decision. So like, as Bob says, you know, Washington can be a very convoluted place. We all want good outcomes. We do not like children being separated from their parents. But the message to the parents on the other side of the border is, don't try and get in here illegally with your children, because you're going to risk being separated from them. It may be for a brief period of time. And we do have to be concerned precisely that this is not being used for illegal purposes of trafficking children into this country.
Well, on that number that the Homeland Security Secretary exposed this week, that of the 12,000 children in government care, the United States government care, 10,000 of those children came alone. They were unaccompanied minors who were either trafficked into the country or simply sent across the border by themselves.
Yeah, you know, I'd also like to add that on this moral continuum that you're talking about, look, we have an immigration policy. We allow 1 million people into the country legally every year. So people who are trying to break the law and get in, sure, I mean, we understand they're coming from terrible circumstances. In some cases, it's just economic opportunities that they're seeking. But we have a legal policy that's quite generous. It's not as if it's just impossible to get into the country. My wife is an immigrant and talks often about her family having to wait 7 years and finding a sponsor here. And she gets a little bit frustrated with people who jump the line. I mean, there's also that moral dimension as well. So it's a complicated issue, but we don't, I think you're quite right that we don't want to just talk about this in slogans. There are human lives involved here in a variety of different ways.
Right, and there are many considerations, and it's a complex thing because of the laws on the books, the precedent, as well as the laws passed here in Congress. And all of that has to be negotiated as we talk through this. But we'll see where this lands, but I do think keeping the security and to protect children in the forefront has to be an obligation. And speaking of that, a terrible story this week. This statement from the Archdiocese of New York from Cardinal Dolan, I'll put it up on the screen for you. The Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, at the direction of Pope Francis, has instructed Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, instructed him that he is no longer to exercise publicly his priestly ministry. Cardinal McCarrick, the former Archbishop of Newark, the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C., has been stripped of authority owing to a 47-year-old sex abuse claim against him, put forward by a minor, now a man in his 60s. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, it's been corroborated. That's
Right.
the other thing. That
Substantiated.
they determined that it was a credible charge, and then it was corroborated. I don't know, they haven't put out the details because they're trying to keep confidentiality in these circumstances. The worrisome thing about this is, let's put this bluntly, everyone knew about Cardinal McCarrick. I've been here in Washington 30 years doing public Catholicism.
There were a lot of stories floating
and these
around.
stories have been floating around. No one knew exactly, what to do about it. Very few of us are in a situation where we could actually do something about this.
Yeah.
And very few people were willing to go on the record.
But some apparently did go to Rome.
However, we know that now we know, because of the recent statements that have been made, that when he was Bishop of Metuchen and when he was Archbishop of Newark, that there were charges against him and settlements.
Yeah, let me read the statement. I want both of you to react to this. This is from the Bishop Cecchio from the Diocese of Metuchen. I can report to you that there has never been any report or allegation that Cardinal McCarrick ever abused any minor during his time here in Metuchen. In the past, there have been allegations that he engaged in sexual behavior with adults. This diocese and the Archdiocese of Newark received 3 allegations of sexual misconduct with adults decades ago. 2 of these allegations resulted in settlements. What does that tell you?
We have a problem here, Raymond, and this is a problem that goes beyond just this incident of sexual abuse. By the way, it was of a seminarian, a high school seminarian. The abuse took place at St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1971 and 72 in the sacristy, as this young seminarian was being prepared to serve Mass. We know that because the lawyer for the victim went public with this. Now, that relationship, of course, is of a man of great power, a priest over a seminarian. So we have an abuse of authority that it was committed. Right. Now we have these 2 charges or these cases where the settlements were given. I want to know a few things. Were the people who brought the charges seminarians or priests of those dioceses? Did McCarrick, Cardinal McCarrick or Archbishop McCarrick have any relationship of authority over those people? Because that's abuse of authority in addition to immoral behavior. What are we talking about here? Payoffs? Who made the payments?
And when?
The settlements, when were they made? And by the way, were there any demands for confidentiality and not going public with the way when these settlements were made? If what the Weinstein case shows, if you own a company and then the company pays off a victim of your sexual depredation, that's a complete abuse of the purpose of that company and of the victim and all the rest. We're talking the Catholic Church here. Now, for Cardinal McCarrick to do, having done these things, is of course immoral, but then for the Catholic Church to pay off victims and not reveal it at the time, I think it would be of interest, for instance, if they were priests or seminarians, that the people in Washington, where he served as Archbishop, would know that their bishop had done this thing in the past, but we never knew that at the time.
Robert Royal.
Yeah, I think that this is a very big network that is going to have to be explored. Several people, Rod Dreher, now an ex-Catholic because he was so disgusted with what he found when he started to dig into these cases, and he had dug into the McCarrick case as well, says that there's a large network, and this is not the only case of what's happened here. I think that we've learned, not only here in the United States, but as we've seen in Chile and some other parts of the world, people who've had contact with the cardinal, or when he was an archbishop, not only going back 47 years, but I think that there are more recent things that they have to be queried about what they knew and when, and did they do anything about this? We are in a very different world than we were, say, 50 years ago. Right. That when discoveries like this take place, we know that there are consequences that go on for decades. Yeah. And just as in the Harvey Weinstein case or some of these other cases that we've been seeing, some of them involve same-sex attractions too. I think we have to say this has to be looked in very carefully because it goes to the credibility of the church at this point in history. We know what a neutron bomb it was that went off in 2002 when the Boston Globe first revealed these abuse cases. this points toward a number of other things that are going to have to be dealt with and cleaned out.
I want to read the Cardinal McCarrick's statement. He said this: "While I have absolutely no recollection of this reported abuse and believe in my innocence, I am sorry for the pain the person who brought the charges has gone through, as well as the scandal such charges cause our people." Unpack that for me, Father.
This is completely unsatisfactory. Earlier in his statement, he said he claims his innocence.
Right.
Then he says, I have no recollection of something. Now, wait a minute. If you said the incident never happened, because you can only claim innocence if you said I didn't do it, how would you recollect the fact that something would have happened, you never did it? Secondly, he says he believes in his innocence. I know I'm innocent if I don't do something. It's not a question of belief. He's sorry for the pain. If he's an innocent man, this victim, he would call him a so-called victim, is inflicting pain on him and on the rest of the church by impugning the reputation of a cardinal. Cardinal McCarrick, the statement I find completely inadequate. If the charges are true, and McCarrick knows they're true, if in fact...
well, he wouldn't have been stripped. He wouldn't have been stripped of public ministry.
That's the judgment of the church.
Right,
but if McCarrick knows that he did these things and that this 67-year-old man, who was a seminarian in high school at the time, actually suffered from him, he should admit it, rather than these convoluted ways. This is an unsatisfactory way to handle this. I'm very upset by that.
Bill Donahue at the Catholic League said, when you look at the timeline of this happened a long time ago. We know that. He said this is not a case of pedophilia, but homosexuality. Your thoughts?
Well, look, as we know from the John Jay report, most of the instances of priestly abuse were not pedophilia. Most people have the impression of young children, 5 or 6 years old. They tended to be adolescents, say from about 12 to 16, and this seminarian appears to have been 16 years old when this happened. So there's a homosexual component to this, but I agree with Father. I think that for his own sake, let alone for the sake of the church, but for his own sake, Cardinal McCarrick should just come clean. If he did this, confess it, express regret, and then go on and ask for God's mercy.
I need to move on to some other topics, including, and again, we're talking about young people. There's a synod on young people coming up in October, where the church has listened. We covered the preparatory document of that, where they brought people from all over the world, young people, including atheists, Muslims, Catholic-believing young people. And again, young people is like up to 30, 35 years old. So they're not little kids. But the intention of this document and the forthcoming synod is to recognize the reality of young people today, to interpret the meaning of that reality, and to choose paths for the church to go forward. So they want to kind of analyze the situation. Now, the document, and in this preparatory document, the term LGBT appears. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender appears. Some are hailing this as an advancement for the church and an embrace, if you will, of gay rights and recognizing gay individuals. Why is that a problem?
This is a big problem. We do not use the political language of the gay rights and associated movement when analyzing the nature of man and the nature of sin. The Catholic Church does not accept that there is a category of human beings created by God meant to commit homosexual activity. We don't believe that bisexual people exist in the sense of saying God made certain people who he wants to have sex with, both men and women. We do not believe in transgenderism. The Catholic Church does not teach that God made some people women but gave them a male body, and therefore they have to discover that they're women by overcoming their male body. We don't believe in any of that. That's a political propaganda term. Using that in this document signals an agreement that all of those categories exist as natural and God-given categories of people. Big mistake.
Robert Royal, I'm sure many of the folks at the Vatican are going to say, but this is the language of the culture and the young people that we're now talking to. Cardinal Baldisseri, who is the secretary of this synod, was asked about it this week. Here's what he said. I'll put it up on the screen. They, meaning the young people who we consulted with, they provided a document and we quoted it. This is the explanation for the inclusion of the term LGBT. Now, reporters have reviewed that original document that the young people submitted. LGBT does not appear in that document. What's happening here?
Well, as you recall, I was there during that week that the 303 young people were there. And, I have to say, I felt somewhat ambivalent because on the one hand, some of them were very enthusiastic and great kids. On the other hand,
And wholly good kids.
yeah, and on the other hand, it was clear that some kind of modern ideology was starting to seep in, perhaps induced by figures within the Vatican rather than by the students themselves. Now, look, of course we know that young people are constantly confronted with the general culture, as we all are, which inevitably is going to involve this LGBT terminology. But just as with the Synod on the Family, a lot of us looked at the preparatory documents for that as well, and there's this sort of B-minus sociology that goes on, where you start with the terminology and the understanding that's out there in the culture. And of course, it's very difficult when you start on the other guy's field to score on Catholicism. You know, you're playing their game. It's an away game that you're playing. So I detect the same sort of thing going on here. Now, you know, perhaps people mean well by including this. You know, this is something that has to be confronted, and in fact, it does have to be confronted. But to start using the language of the culture does not bode well for what the consequences will be.
Okay, we'll keep monitoring this. Before we run out of time, I've got to do this. The Pope, in an interview with Reuters, suggested that he first learned about that dubia, the 4 cardinals who proposed questions to him about the last synod, about the exhortation with marriage and what he intended by creating an opening that would grant communion to divorced and remarried Catholics without an annulment. They wanted clarification on that. The Pope says he learned about this dubia from reading the newspaper, and that this is a way of doing things that is, let us say, not ecclesial. Father.
Well, I regret to say that the historical record will not support the Pope's recollection on this, because it's quite clear, and Cardinal Burke has said it, and Cardinal Brandmuller has also said it in these last days, that this material, the dubia, were given to the Pope personally by Cardinal Caffarra, delivered to his office, and also delivered to Cardinal Muller, 2 months before it was in the newspaper. So yeah, if the Pope's mail is intercepted and he's not reading it, then he's got a problem that he has to deal with in his staff. Cardinal Muller should now be asked, did you get that letter 2 months ahead of time, as Cardinal Burke says Caffarra did? I think the Pope here doesn't want to talk about the dubia because obviously he never answered them. And I would counsel him, as a priest who supports and prays for him and for the papacy, it's not in your interest, Holy Father, to ignore the Cardinal's dubia and then to minimize it by saying, this was a newspaper story and that's not how I want cardinals communicating with me. They didn't communicate with you through the newspaper, Holy Father. The record will speak for itself.
Robert.
Look, as we know, these 4 cardinals are sterling men, and they follow the rules. They're committed to Catholicism, and what they did was, in their understanding, what you do when the Pope raises a certain number of questions. They present these things to him privately. Now, I think what the Pope meant to say, and you know, we keep waiting for there to be a correction out of the Vatican about this, perhaps what he meant to say was he felt that this was a not an ecclesial way of going, because he felt that he'd been contradicted or he'd been criticized.
Or challenged, yeah.
But the simple chronology of this just makes no sense. And if there's a problem here, if he misspoke, then fine, then come out and say that. But I think Father is exactly right about this. It beggars belief, even if that letter never made its way up from the residence to him personally, it beggars belief that someone in those 2 months, probably Cardinal Muller, did not have a conversation with him about the dubia.
I need to quick react to a couple of comments the Pope made over the weekend, very quickly. He said, it is painful to say this. This was at a Saturday audience. People speak of varied families, of various kinds of family. The family as man and woman in the image of God is the only one. This really wasn't widely reported, but he said it. Your thoughts?
Yeah, he was meeting with an Italian family group, and it was very encouraging because there's so much propaganda now saying that there's more than one type of family, that 2 people of the same sex who adopt a child can be considered a family. The Church doesn't teach that. The family is Adam and Eve and then their children, and then the rest of humanity follows suit. The Pope also talked about abortion as being the kind of activity that Nazis used. I mean, so the Pope obviously saying things that the Catholic Church has always taught, and it's very encouraging because there are a lot of voices out there nowadays who are trying to say, what Catholics teach about man, woman, and child, that's passé. The Pope is saying, no, that's the truth.
Robert Royal, I want you to react to this very quickly. He also, in that interview with Reuters, he said, let me be clear in these things. He was asked about immigration policy in the United States. And he said, I respect the Bishops' Conference. It is not just about Trump. The governments of the past also pursued policies like this. There was already a problem. He said, I believe that you cannot reject people who arrive. You have to receive them, help them, look after them, accompany them, and then see where to put them. But throughout all of Europe, he says, this is going on.
Yeah, actually what he said there is that populism is not the proper response to the refugee and the immigration problem. Now, you know, in political philosophy, there are various definitions of what we're at right now, populism or, you know, something else, revolt of the masses or whatever. Yeah. But look, the reality we have to face is that people in Europe and in North America, Australia, New Zealand, feel that immigration is overwhelming their cultures. This is why I said earlier that 70% of the people in the United States want no exceptions on the border enforcement. What's happened in a variety of places, Italy is most notably the case where now there's been a kind of a Trumpian revolution even in Italy. You have 50% youth unemployment, and you have thousands of people arriving every week down in Sicily or in other places in the south of Italy. The society is simply unable to absorb this sorts of thing. And then other countries feel a threat to their ways of life. So, look, we understand what he's trying to say. It is a good idea to try to take care of immigrants and refugees globally.
And the church's focus has to be, and his focus has to be on humanity and caring for people. And the church does that, is doing that, and should do that here in the United States. They are not Border Patrol. And that's why it's perfectly within the rights of the church to welcome immigrants, feed them at soup kitchens, support them, which parishes in your archdiocese here in Washington do. Of course. That is the proper role of the church and appropriate for the church to act in.
Yes, but I would add...
But that's different from national policy.
Yeah, I mean, national policies, each individual country is simply going to have to make a decision about this because, look, politicians are responsible. The Holy Father believes in democratic procedures. Politicians are responsible to their people, and their people say, look, we feel that we're being overwhelmed here. We feel like we're being squeezed out in certain directions. I think that has to be taken into account in policy.
Thank you. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, thank you both for being here. You can follow Robert and Father Jerry's columns at thecatholicthing.org. And in other news, the Trump administration announced Tuesday that the United States is withdrawing from the United Nations Human Rights Council. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, delivered the message in a joint press conference. They noted that the UN was warned a year ago that the U.S. would stay in the Council only if essential reforms were achieved. They decried the membership of countries such as China, Cuba, and Venezuela that are themselves accused of rights violations. And they further criticized what they called the Council's chronic bias against Israel. Pompeo acknowledged the noble vision of the Council, but said it had devolved into a body of politicizing and scapegoating in order to defend offending nations.
The Human Rights Council is a poor defender of human rights. Worse than that, the Human Rights Council has become an exercise in shameless hypocrisy, with many of the world's worst human rights abuses going ignored.
Haley said that the U.S. would be happy to rejoin the Council if reform takes place. Finally tonight, an update on the dire situation in Syria for the Christian population there. We're joined by Father ytsync-en. He is the Director of Ecumenical Relations for the Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, churches in the world. Father, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now let's talk about the situation for Christians in Syria. There were 2 million. Now we're down to 899,000. What is the situation on the ground? It is, as we described in the open, fairly dire.
First, thank you very much for the invitation. I am very honored and pleased to be here with you.
We're delighted.
And to discuss with you the crisis which began 2011. We had in Syria more or less 10% of the whole population Christians. At that time, Syria had 23 millions, whereas today we are talking about only 18 millions living in Syria. Because during the crisis, we lost people in the term that they left Syria. And more than 5 million, they are outside of Syria, whereas we have 6.1 million IDPs, internally displaced people in Syria. So till 2015, Christians didn't leave Syria. So they really accepted all the war circumstances there and remained in Syria. But in 2015, some borders to Syria were opened from Turkey to Greece and then to Europe.
ISIS swept in. They destroyed churches, whole communities. Give us a sense of what was happening and what continues to happen. I know there are still, you have missing bishops, you have a Catholic priest who was flogged with rubber hoses,
Yes.
dragged through the streets. Give me a sense of how this looks from the ground.
Now, newly, as you know, East Ghouta was liberated and a Nusra Front left the area.
Right.
And there we have two towns, Harasta and Erbil. We went there and we found everything destroyed. The town, the churches, everything what people left before leaving now is destroyed. Therefore, where ISIS was, everywhere, they destroyed everything. And we have seen, if you open YouTube, you can see them destroying the figures of Saint Mary, Jesus, churches, icons, even in Ma'lula, Saint Tekla.
Right.
You know, she is the disciple of St. Paul. So this monastery was even destroyed. We renovated the monastery. And now the church, and we are preparing everything, as I said, that the nuns can come. They just in one word, they were kidnapped for 4 months. And now the kidnapped bishops of Aleppo, now the 5th years, and we have no news, anything, only rumors about them. And I used this interview to ask everybody, even the US administration, to help in finding the fate of both metropolitans, John Yohanna Ibrahim or John Ibrahim and Boulos Yazigi.
No, it's really, it's unbelievable that after all this time, there's still no word on their whereabouts at all. You run the largest NGO in Syria. You're operating all over Syria, serving millions of people. Give me a sense of what you're doing and why this work is so important now.
I belong to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch and all the East. His Beatitude, Patriarch John X, is the head of the church. His Beatitude called us the charitable arm of the church. And we have our symbol, the Good Samaritan. And this guides us to help everyone following the steps, the footsteps of the Good Samaritan.
And you're rebuilding homes, rebuilding schools, communities, churches. I mean, it's really everything. You're really rebuilding civil society.
We are working in all sectors. But it's very important also, not only to give the service to the people in order just to serve them, but bringing people together of different affiliations, religious or ethnic, together. It's in order even to have a harmonious society and to rebuild the coexistence between all Syrians, and at the same time to prepare them for the future, for the peace in Syria. So, for instance, when we are doing psychosocial support for different people of different areas, they came together for a week. They stay there together. At the first day, when they came together, they feel they are enemies. Because you are this, you are that, you are Shia, you are Sunni, you are Christian, you are Druze, whatever. But then they realize on the next day that all of them have the same faith. They are missing some relatives, some family members, somebody killed. So they realize that all victims of this war. So they started to become friends. At the last day, they will exchange emails, Facebook, whatever, cell phone numbers, and be in touch with each other. And in this, what we do, those people finishing the course, the psychosocial course, they will go outside to their communities and be our ambassadors. They are telling about the good work the church does, and at the same time, they tell that all of us are victims of the war. We don't have to really conflict with each other, but we can rebuild Syria in order to have a better future for everyone.
Before I let you go, you do this work at great personal peril. I know you've been targeted. personally. Those around you have been wounded. Give me a sense of what that's like, and why do you continue this work?
I'm not better than my Lord, Jesus Christ. He died on the cross for the whole, for the entire world. So when I do 1/10% or much less than what he does for the world, so it's nothing. So my life is not worthy when I compare it with the lives of hundreds, thousands of millions of people. So therefore, I will continue this work with the blessing and prayer of His Beatitude, Patriarch John X. And no matter if I will wound it or target it, this will not let me go a step back. It's the opposite. I will continue this work until the end of my life, or when I will do something else in the church. But so long I am the director of this organization, I will continue the work. And I have visited all governorates. By the way, for instance, I visited not only Aleppo, I went also to Raqqa, to Deir ez-Zor, to Hasaki, to Qamishli, and I celebrated the divine liturgy in Qamishli. In Qamishli there, it's the first time after years that somebody's Orthodox, yes, Christian, celebrated the divine liturgy there. It was amazing for the people living the divine liturgy after that much years.
Terror, yes. Where is USAID? Vice President Pence announced a change in policy in October where particularly religious groups on the ground would be given that aid directly to get around the bureaucracy. It seems, to my eyes, the bureaucracy here in Washington has stymied that help. As in so many other areas of the government, the Trump administration appoints people at the top of them, but you have career bureaucrats beneath. And apparently that aid, the aid that would normally go to people in your region, have gone to the White Helmets, which is a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, who are Sunni Muslims only targeting and helping Muslims. Where's the aid that should be coming to you? Has it lessened from the United States?
First, I would like really to thank all our partners worldwide. We have 22 partners worldwide, UN agencies in Syria and others outside of Syria operating with us in order to help the Syrians, all Syrians, Muslims and Christians. Because we are the church, the largest one, the largest organization, we are trying to help everybody because people are awaiting this help from you. So people are awaiting our assistance, and we are awaiting the assistance of USAID and other US organizations to assist us in order to have enough to help others. I would kindly ask them to rethink about their funds. And if this money is only for humanitarian purpose, I think Abourt is eligible and the most one eligible in Syria to receive funds from USAID and other US organizations. We have only 1/10 nowadays of the money we had in 2013, 2015, and it's nothing compared with the needs of the people, especially after the USA and alliances or people working on this to defeat ISIS. Now we have a lot of people, they are jobless, they are in need, they need their houses to be rehabilitated, schools, infrastructure, churches, mosques, everything. So we have to help all these people to have a better future in Syria, and USAID and other US organizations are welcomed to help us in order to assist the people in Syria.
Father Shehadeh, thank you so much for being here.
God bless you.
Our prayers go with you, and keep us in your prayers. And for more information on the Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch, Father Alexei's work on behalf of Syrian Christians and all those in the region, and how you can help, go to the Patriarchate's website. They're at GOPADERD, GOPADERD, GOPADERD.org. Before we go, I want to remind you that the DVD version of Paul, Apostle of Christ, starring Jim Caviezel and James Faulkner, is available now in stores everywhere and online. You can pick up a copy of that. That's all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Be sure to join us next week. We'll have a preview of the PBS Independence Day Capitol 4th special with producer Michael Colbert. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. We have some other special guests, too. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now. Thank you.